That's going. Yep. Okay. And so today is reading Plato, Twilight 2020, week 6. What is Platonism? So yeah, we're kind of wrapping up today with the reading and with a little, just wrapping up on that exercise stuff we do at the beginning of the class. We'll do that first, then we'll do the reading, and then we can just have a fairly general conversation with, on my part, a glass of wine. So whatever you guys want to have, and yeah, and we'll wind it up for the session and for the year. All right. So, what is philosophy? What is wisdom, Sophia? For Plato, it's all about turning around, looking around, not with the bodily, not turning the body around, but turning around the attention of your mind's eye. Not looking out for reality in the particular sensible things, but inward to their formal nature. And we'll get more in today into what formal philosophy means for us. You see, when you look at particular sensible things, because they feel so concrete in themselves, we tend to consider that their being is in their independent particularity. I'm getting a bit of feedback there. If someone can everyone can just mute, that's better. Thank you. We suppose that their essential being is their particularity, right? The particularity of the cup, that sort of thing. And then by some force of contortion with the modern philosophy, we propose that their essence is in some material reality beyond our experiential cup, beyond our experiential object. So it's actually unknown and unknowable to which all our knowledge refers. So it's a reality that's unknowable and unknown to which we refer to all our knowledge. And that's kind of the materialist. I call that the materialist view. It's given various names. The irony of this conclusion is that it starts off affirming what's immediately known into the senses. The cup is there, it's real. But then you realize it's in the senses, and then you say, well, that can't be real. There must be something unknown beyond it, which is real. But Platonism rejects this absurdity. It's not to reject experience, which some people think. It's not to reject reality. My cup is real and immediate in my senses. It's not to reject empirical science. Rather, it's to interpret sensible experience differently. I pay attention to how I construct my sensible objects from my experience. It notices in things that they have a common formal nature. Platonism is about paying attention to this formal nature. So, consider the problem. What is knowledge? What do we know? What is the being of the objects we know? We have tried, as other philosophers have, to ground our knowledge in the external material reality of particular things. Of course it's there, solid and independent from me. But that doesn't work because everything I know is in my senses, and the objects I construct are in my mind, in me. How else can we ground our knowledge? We've tried, as other philosophers have, to ground it linguistically by grounding a word through its meaning. But its meaning can only be expressed in other words. And their meaning again can only be expressed in other words. And so it goes, words to meaning, and so on. As we said, in terms of semiotics, in terms of signs, sign, signifier, signified, signifier, signified. Now, Plato grounds our knowledge via the concept, if you like, or the idea or the form. The cup is grounded via the concept of the cup. If I were to fashion a cup out of clay, then I might fashion it according to this model. If I were to define it in words, I would define it according to this model. What is a cup? Likewise, for pure concepts like justice, it's grounded in the concept of justice. This is its formal nature. This is where the essence of ideas, meanings, things reside. Their essence is not particular, but general and it is invisible, insensible. So what can we say about the formal essence, this formal essence that we're talking about here, and its relation to things? First thing to say is the first way I've tried to give you a bit of analogy here is exactly as the Platonists did, where the essence of things is like the essence of number. And I'm going to share a few pictures now. Let's get that going. Pictures that some of them we're fairly familiar with. Okay, so so the essence of things is like the essence of numbers. So, what is two? Consider how two objects express two-ness. Two itself is a concept insensible, but I can show you two by example. Do you see what I mean? In a similar way, non-geometrical forms like justice, beauty, and equality can be shown by likenesses using examples or analogies. This is hard to see at the moment, but let's just take it as a hypothesis. Now let's consider, we looked at what is two, now let's consider, well, what is one? One cup, one stone, one beautiful building, one beautiful boy. Now, one particular just society. For Plato, one thing or one concept participates in oneness in a non-arbitrary way. You can recognize one without defining it or proving it. It's showing, not saying. Do you see what I mean? What is the nature of each one's oneness? And we've talked a little bit about this already. So before we do, let's just move on to similarity, to likeness, sameness, and difference, which we've talked about. To answer this, we need to consider similar things. Two similar ships, right? Or pictures of ships, they have the same proportions. Two similar cups, similar in shape, but different in color, different in texture, right? Notice that like things are equal in some ways, right? The cups are equal in that they're cups and unequal in other ways. Their similarity, this sameness and difference comes down to this. Now consider that a comparison of all things can come down to this. The way they are the same and the ways they are different. Now let's return to one. One thing is completely the same as itself. One thing is completely the same as itself. So what is the nature of this sameness? This is so simple, so elementary that we kind of miss it. The problem is we think it's more complicated than it actually is. It is the sameness, it is the same as itself and not the same as not itself. Same as itself and not the same as not itself. So we're looking at this actually geometrically. So we can take that Roman numeral 1 and say the inside is the same as itself and not itself. And so also the score or the slash on the page. For Plato, yeah, so there's that opposites going on there. The one and not the one. It's the same as itself and not the same as not itself. Okay. So we're looking at this geometrically now to help us try to understand this oneness. So we've used it previously for concepts and that sort of thing, but just think there's one yellow egg, if you like. There's one and not one. And so this, again, this is very simple, but it's where we want to start. We're not starting with language. We're not starting with a reference to external materiality. We're starting to look at this fundamental formal nature of the oneness of everything and every concept. One and not one. So we've now drawn it as a circle to make it nice and clean for us. And we can think, again, we can think of justice in this way. So we can only define the just in terms of what it's not. So it's a 3-in-1 thing. There's a distinction between, this geometry, between the inside and the outside. The cut of the circle, the tonal difference makes the distinction. It's the same and other distinction. The unity of form is in the distinction. So this is, within Plato, the elementary form of the one. Okay, and we talked about this in terms of the island and the sea, and I think for some people this makes it quite clear, because to have an island, you think of it just as the island, the solid island, but then if you take away the sea, you've taken away the shoreline, you've taken away the island. So the island needs the sea, and this is this other in the same idea, right? So in some sense or whatever, injustice is not justice. Let me say that so we don't confuse it. In love, when we define love, when we think of love, in that is its opposite, not love. Pleasure, its opposite, perhaps its opposite is pain. Okay. So, all right, so we've done that. And so it's same and other. All right. Now, another way of thinking about this, and I'm not sure whether to come to this yet, I might have just said it and not shown it. So is to think of it as foreground and background. Okay, so in order to have foreground, you need to have the background. So if we think of this kangaroo sign, an important part of the sign is that it is the background. In fact, these signs, the background is actually what's reflective. And so the kangaroo itself is like an absence when you shine your headlights on it at night. So if it was just all foreground, then you couldn't see the kangaroo, right? I've just left an outline so you know where it is. So you need foreground and you need background. But background is background. It's not the same as foreground. It's an absence. And you need that absence. You need that negation. And another way of thinking about this is these sorts of perceptions sort of tests where you get ambiguous foreground and background. So if you focus on the black, you get maybe the vase. And if you focus on the white, you get the faces. And in some of these, maybe not this one, it flips between the two. There's a sense in which you see the one and not the other, and then you see the other and not the one. So it flips. And if that's working for you, then that's a really good analogy to see that that you need, there's two different opposites often here. If you're talking about justice, that's in the foreground. If you're talking about injustice, that's in the foreground. So these pairs of opposite forms, they're not the same, but they're perfect opposites. Okay, so that'll probably do us for now before we get on to the of the slides anyway. Let me close them up. Right. Okay, so just to finish off this summary, and notice how we construct our world as we go by finding differences, by seeing differences, by seeing how there is a difference here and a difference there. We thought about this when imagining how a newborn baby constructs its world from its own sensual experience. At first, there's all this undistinguished sensations, kind of like white noise, a confusion of light and sound and touch and so forth. Then the baby starts to make distinctions in its experience. It starts to construct differences and makes its world through likeness and unlikeness. More relatable perhaps to us, because we're not babies and maybe we've forgotten what it is like to be a baby, are examples of where we've constructed our world in a very small way. So I gave the example of going to Auntie Agatha's farm, where she's got all her chickens and she's named them all. And when I arrive, I just think, well, that's ridiculous. They all look the same. But after a couple of weeks, I'm calling them by their names and I can see the differences. So there's a sense in which my experience hasn't changed, except in the way that I've changed it in finding those differences. And it's really good to think about where that's happened with you. I mean, a very obvious one is with a language. When I first heard Greek or I first heard French, it's just a sea of noise. And then when you learn a bit, you start distinguishing what people are talking about, and it comes out more and more. Nothing's changed in a sense in what you're experiencing, but you're constructing your experience of those sounds. In this way, in this form, I construct my world from experience, including my experience of you. I don't know you as you in yourself. I only know you as my experience of you. I surmise that you're another observer just like me, but I don't really know that in any more concrete way than just surmising from my experience. Can you see how the external causation of experience, the causation might be external, even though the experience is internal? I don't cause my experience to be the way it is. I don't cause the tea in my cup to get cold. Nevertheless, my experience is in me. That's an important point to get over, and most modern philosophy can't get over that point. I don't cause my experience in some senses. In important senses, I don't cause my experience. I don't make it the way it is, but it's still in me. So I construct my world from my experience, and likewise, you construct yours. And this is how we have shared experience. This is how we have our more or less shared objects. This is how we share the experience called my cup. So that's it. Essentially, that is Platonism. Platonism is the formal approach. By looking up, not looking down, or if you like, by turning in and reflecting on how the mind's eye observes itself. Platonism is completely reflexive, looking inward, self-referencing. There's no reference to a supposed outside world beyond my knowing. And the formal nature of everything is an opposite nature. Everything has its other hidden in it. That's it. That's what it's all about. And in the classes that you'll do from here on, if you see that in the background, you mightn't quite understand it yet, but if you see that in the background, the whole of Plato can open up for you, and I assure you, and Effie maybe can assure you later, that if you go on and read some of the other dialogues after this class, then you'll find it a lot easier. Yeah, so if you want to come back for more, that's great. But now we'll go on to have a look at today's reading and the final part of the dialogue where the whole scene ends. But before we do that, any questions, comments, or reflections?
Yeah, I have a comment on that shared experience thing that you said. We have this understanding that we share a concert or share an experience or whatever it is, but it's fascinating to me that that experience can be a totally different, and it will be for every single person, totally different perspective. That yellow cup will be can be very different for each person. So it's shared, but it's also individual. Am I making sense?
Yes, that's right. That's right. And it's even more extreme than that. Like that idea that you have the same experience that I have, I construct myself. You know, if you think about going back to the baby, it's a big thing for the baby to get to the point at which it realizes that its parents, or at least it presumes, or whatever you want to say, that its parents are like it, that its parents are doing the same thing as it's doing. You know, so you actually construct that idea that you are sharing a concert together. So it's quite extreme in that way. Plato is quite extreme in that way, because otherwise you're going to say, oh, well, first of all, there is the concert, and then there's my experience of it and your experience of it. But in this way of understanding how we know, probably good to think about it in terms of the baby constructing its world. That idea that Dimitri sitting beside me is having a similar experience to me, I construct, you know.
But we assume, don't we? We make assumptions as humans that, you saw the same perspective of that cup or the concert, and we assume that the people have arrived at the same place or conclusions and so on, and it creates real issues because we make those assumptions. We don't necessarily arrive at the same place.
That's right. Yeah, I sometimes think about it going to a big event like there's lots of things happening, maybe like a festival or a demonstration, a rally where there's lots of things happening at different places, and we have this notion that there is. So everyone has their experience, someone's standing where people are chanting really loudly, or someone go, and everyone does different things, and then you'll swap your ideas at the end about what your experience was like. And that this is one time when it's difficult to say what is the overriding. People often say eye in the sky reference point. What is the actual rally, and what is the actual or festival, and what is the actual overriding event or that everyone is experiencing? Well, there isn't really one. It's just you actually bring together all your experiences and say, well, that's what that thing was. So it's doing this the opposite way around. First, there is your experience, and then within your experience, I construct, well, Dimitri was at the same rally too, and she had a different experience, and then we can construct it from there. And that's why I think it's a good way to think of where Plato was talking about, the baby and using the forms to construct its, that it's remembering, because it's that recollection, to construct its reality. If we think back to that, because we forget what a big thing it was to say the world, not me, the world, and then to make the world That's one of the biggest steps that we first make, is to say, I, not I. Not I is the world. And then you do all that other stuff. And it's incredible what we do, but it comes from this basis. And so it's all self-referencing, which is amazing. That's Plato.
So it's an experience, just memory. Like, is it just memory? And doesn't memory change with further experiences? So, how I felt, about an event may change with time. So it's not just internal, because the outside world changes your internal as well.
Okay, so you close your eyes, you walk into or it's pitch dark, you walk into a room you're very familiar with, right? Like, say it's your lounge room, you know where the table is, you know where the couch is, or whatever. But maybe you spun around a few times, and as soon as you touch the table or something, you know where everything else is in the room. So you have this mental image of the room, right? And then maybe you go to touch the table and you touch something soft and squishy and it slides away, like a snake or something. You have an experience that you don't expect and you're surprised by. So in a way, that's a way of sort of saying, well, there's two things going on there. First of all, maybe what you're talking about is the memory. You've closed your eyes, right? You remember the room, and then you touch the table. So you do some sort of reference thing. That's not memory. That is having an experience. Okay, so there's those two things going on there. One is memory, and so it's often hard to see our constructed world like that. And one exercise, I've got it in my book because I think it's really helpful, a whole page where you find your blind spot. So I don't know whether has anyone found their blind spot before? Could probably look it up on, yeah. Okay, seeing Levi has, yeah. It's a really helpful thing when we're talking about something like this. So, you do this thing with focusing on a point, and then you've got a cross or something over here, and it disappears when you move it to a certain point on a piece of paper. And then you have two parallel lines or something, and the line, and there's a gap in the line or whatever, and it actually fills in. Your brain is working hard to construct this reality. You think it's solid in there, right? But you're making it solid in that sense.
Mm.
So, yeah. I mean, I'm slipping into that inside-outside sort of thing as we're talking. But, again, perhaps go back to the baby's experience. The baby's experiencing its self, its sensations. Its sensations are being, perhaps, we theorize, caused externally, but it's not experiencing something external, it's experiencing its own sensations. Focus on that and then move forward to everything else. See if that works. All right. Any other questions before we get to the reading? All right. And if you're watching comments, if people are throwing things in there because they're, yeah. Okay. All right. Well, I'll keep going then. So on to the reading. This passage can seem difficult, infuriating, and simplistic, but there is actually something elementary going on that's very interesting. And let's try to point this out. It introduces participation. So we have introduced this quite a bit, where things participate in their forms. We've done two participates in the form of two. Sensible things participate in their, or partake in their formal nature. So at about page 100D, what makes a sensible thing beautiful is that it partakes in absolute beauty. It shares in beauty. There's a presence of absolute beauty in it, or communing with it. Beautiful things are made beautiful by beauty. Now, then we get on to this greatness and smallness stuff, which sounds really silly. But there are some things in it worth pointing out. For Plato and the Pythagoreans, arithmetic generation is not about addition, but more like a growth from an original unity, if you like a seed into a tree with all its differentiation, or like a fertilized egg growing by dividing, making itself other to itself. Think about how a cell divides into two and then divides again and divides again, all inside the original cell egg. Numbers grow in this way, not by bringing two together, but by one becoming two. For the Platonists and the Pythagoreans, that is actually what arithmetic is. When Plato says great is great by greatness, and 10 is greater than 2, not by reason, that 10 is greater than 2 by reason of manyness. The point is to pay attention to the formal generation, the growth, and not the particulars. Okay, and so of course we get to this tallness stuff. So Socrates uses the relative height of the folks in the discussion as an example. Now, Phaedo is one of these basketball tall type guys. And then we've got Simmias, who's in the middle. And then Socrates is famously short and ugly. Well, ugly is not relevant, but he's famously short. Anyway, Simmias has smallness relative to Phaedo, but tallness relative to Socrates. So I prepared this earlier. So there we've got Phaedo, the basketballer, although he's a bit round for a basketballer, and we've got Simmias and Socrates, right? Okay. So really all it's saying is that we're trying to pay attention to the form here, the form of tallness, right? Not to any particular tallness. So Simmias is tall in terms of Socrates, right? So if Socrates is your measure, Simmias partakes in tallness. But if Phaedo is your measure, Simmias doesn't partake in tallness, it partakes in shortness. That's it. But it's simple but important. Tall or bigger, if we can say bigger, is not something inherent in the individual. It requires a reference, a point of distinction. It is relative, not absolute. If we say that there is always something smaller than anything, so if you just think of anything, you're sort of going down to Simmias, and then you're going down to, the smallest person, and then you're going down to a cell in the body, and then you're going down to the organelles in the cell, and then you're going down to, and you just keep going down and down. There's always, you need a reference point. You need to talk about what scale you're on. Is this a small virus, this COVID virus, or is it a large virus? We're not talking on the same scale, are we, as we're talking about with humans? We're talking about viruses, which are so small. So smallness and tallness are always relative, right? And the same with lots of these other opposites. So if we consider that there's always something smaller, and maybe if you like, in terms of technology, it's really just a limit, and there's always something larger, then we can say that everything participates in smallness and everything participates in largeness, depending where you draw the distinction. Measurement is not absolute. It needs a reference, like when you take a scientific photo and you put the lens cap there to see that, you know, it's something tiny or something huge. And maybe one way to think, another way to think about this, and tell me if it helps you, is if I say, where do you, if someone asks me where I live, I say, well, I live in the East. You live in the East. East Brunswick, East Altona. Do you live east of the railway line? Eastern Australia? Eastern Europe, the Orient, Asia? Eastern where? Imagine you're on the equator. Show me where East is. Actually, when you do East-West on the equator, you're not actually making a distinction. On a sphere, you have to draw a circle. But if you're measuring heights, for example, so say your family, you've got the doorway, you haven't got a measuring tape, you mark a height. This is mum's height, right? Everyone is either taller or shorter than that height. And that's the elementary measurement. You think of the meter. How do you decide the meter? Well, there's a meter in Paris. It's this long, and everything's measured against that. We're used to having rulers, you know, which already have it marked out. We're talking about something more elementary than that. Understand this formal nature of greatness and smallness, tallness and shortness, as is explained in the dialogue here, goes a long way to understanding this formal approach. East is the opposite of West. Greater is the opposite of smaller. East can never be West. Greater can never be smaller. So things can be greater and smaller. So Simmias is greater than Socrates, if Socrates is the measure, and smaller if Phaedo is the measure. But greatness and smallness can never be their own opposite. Nor will any other formal opposite be its own opposite, while still remaining what it is, because it can never become its own opposite. It will withdraw or cease to exist. A form will never become other to itself, and yet it brings forth its opposite, opposing. So remember when we started with the Phaedo, when Socrates was taking the manacles off and he said, oh, the pleasure. And he talked about how pleasure follows pain. They're associated, they're together like the island and the sea, but they're never their opposite. Okay, so opposites can never be their opposites. But then in the dialogue, there's this objection. Hang on a minute. Hadn't we just said that generation is from opposites to opposites? And at page 103a, the answer is yes, opposite things come from opposite things, but the abstract concept of opposite can never become its own opposite. To complicate things further, there are these special particular things that take on the characteristics of their opposite form, and they also oppose opposites. And the examples he gives is snow opposes heat and fire opposes cold. Snow, so when snow is heated up, it goes away, and fire retreats from cold. You can never have warm snow or cold fire. Now consider also odd and even. Remember how I said that Plato and the Pythagoreans saw the number series, this generation by opposites, where one opposite is odd and the other is even. So we can think of 1 and 0, we can think of left and right, or a pendulum or something like that, from one opposite to the next. Now take 3. It can never be even, just as fire can never be cold. Number 3 opposes the opposite of odd, which is even. Odd brings forth the idea of even, but never admits it. Pleasure brings forth pain. Pain brings forth pleasure. Likewise with fire. When cold approaches, it never admits it, but perishes or goes away. And so, this is the argument he's bringing it back to, is his argument about the immortality of the soul. Soul is to mortality like 3 is to even. It never admits it. The soul is alive and does not admit dying, so it must always be alive. Okay, so we can discuss that and how persuaded we are by that argument in a moment. Oh, now I've done this in the wrong order. Wait a minute, I'm just going to share the screen again. But I can't talk and do things at the same time. There we go, share screen. All right. So there's our, so then we've got, here's our taller and our shorter, and we've got, if Socrates is the measure, then Simmias is in the taller. This is taller shaded in here. If Socrates is the measure, then Simmias is not in the shorter, and the opposite over here. So that's hopefully fairly straightforward. And so now we can just think of this in bigger and smaller, and perhaps we can think of, okay, so we've got mum on the wall or whatever, and maybe dad's bigger, and so he's inside the circle, and the baby's shorter, and so the baby's outside the circle. So we're just trying to move this towards the formal sort of thing. Are you bigger than me? You're either bigger or not bigger than me. Same in other differential value. The unity of the form is in the distinction. You must have a distinction. You must draw the line somewhere in order to make the distinction. And then you can move from there and make all the different nuances. And so that's bigger. And now we're moving to smaller, where we've emphasized smaller. It's like we've emphasized a sea rather than the island. Are you smaller than me? You're either smaller or not smaller than me. Same other differentiation. Same here equals smaller, other equals not smaller. The unity of the form is in distinction. You must have a distinction to say what smaller is. So then we got to the odd and even thing. In that 3 is 3, it is always odd and never admits even. So oddness is to odd, never admits even. Fire is to hot, never admits cold. Soul is to alive, never admits dying. So what about that? Now I got to stop the share screen. I don't know how to do this. Right. Okay. So remember when we started, we talked about 2 and how it is insensible, unchanging, and like the divine. So we don't have to think of gods in the sky. We just think of it's insensible and it's unchanging, and therefore it is divine in Plato's sense. Well, in the same way, 3 is immortal. And according to Plato, in the same way, so is our soul. But notice that it's a very firm, very formal sense. Only that the soul survives. Only in that it is like 3, the number 3, or like the number 1. The soul participates 1. So it exists in the same way that the number 1 exists. Remember at the beginning we said, what is 2? How and where does it exist? Well, this proof that he's just used here, even if we think it's a proof, is only a proof of existence of the soul's existence in that sense. Might be a bit disappointing. So, after this, that ends the reading. And so after this, Socrates launches into this marvelous story about the earth, where we might, which some people might want to read if they're into the Plato myths. I know a lot of people in other classes are, but I'll just briefly give you a summary of that. So Socrates recounts this myth. It's maybe an Orphic myth. We don't really know where it comes from and how much he's embellished it. So he imagines, to imagine the afterlife, we should imagine the atmosphere above is like the sea for us. Where we live is like hollows in the depths of the ocean. Souls live around the surface of the atmosphere like we live around the sea. Water and sea is to our lives as air is to theirs. He also describes the underworld with chasms and a great river. When we enter the afterlife, we are guided by guardian angels. There is a judgment day, maybe. Souls go to judgment and sentencing, and that determines where you end up, hell, purgatory even, or heaven. Those purified by philosophy live always all together without their bodies and pass to a still more beautiful abode. So he tells this marvelous myth. And then what is the status of this exactly? I mean, why is he telling us this myth? And right at the end, I'll just read what he says about this myth. Of course, no reasonable person ought to insist that the facts are exactly as I have just described. This is at 114d, if you want to look at it later. But that either this or something very like it is a true account of our soul and their future habitation, since there is certainly evidence that the soul is deathless. I mean, he's just given that evidence. This, I think, is both a fitting contention and a belief worth risking. For the risk is a noble one. We should use such accounts to enchant ourselves with. And that is why I have already drawn this tale out so long. We should use such myths to enchant ourselves. Perhaps we could say this is a lullaby for the dying. And so we come to the end. Socrates says he will take his bath so that the folks don't have to wash his body later. And then there's a story of a good jailer. He's kind of like the good thief on Calvary, who sings his praise. And then I'm just going to read the last section for the finish. So up until this time, most of us had been fairly successful in keeping back our tears. But when we saw that he was drinking, that he had actually drunk it, we could do this no longer. In spite of myself, the tears came pouring out, says Phaedo, so that I covered my face and wept broken-heartedly. Not for him, but for my own calamity in losing such a friend. Crito had given up even before me and had gone out when he could not restrain his tears. Apollodorus, who had never stopped crying, even before, now broke out into such a storm of passionate weeping that he made everyone in the room break down, except Socrates himself, who said, "Really, my friends, what a way to behave! Why, that was my reason for sending away the women, to prevent this sort of discordant behavior, because I'm told that one should make one's end in a reverent silence. Calm yourselves and be brave. This made us feel ashamed, and we controlled our tears. Socrates walked about and presently, saying that his legs were heavy, lay down on his back. The man kept his hands upon Socrates, and after a little while examined his feet and legs, then pinched his foot and asked if he felt it. Socrates said no. Then he did the same to his legs, and moving gradually up in this way, let us see that he was getting cold and numb. Presently, the man felt him again and said that when it reaches the heart, Socrates would be gone. The coldness was spreading about as far as his waist when Socrates uncovered his face and said, and these were his last words, "Crito, we ought to offer a cock to Asclepius. See to it and don't forget." "No, it shall be done." "Are you sure there's nothing else?" Socrates made no reply, but after a little while he stirred, and when the man uncovered him, his eyes were fixed. When Crito saw this, he closed the mouth and the eyes. This was the end of our comrade, who was, we may fairly say, of all those whom we knew in our time, the bravest and also the wisest and the most just. Okay, that's the end of the Phaedo. Thanks for coming. It's been great sharing it with you. And I think I might go and get my glass of wine. And if you haven't got it already, you guys can do this, do the same, and we can have a final chat. Okay. How was that? Did we like Phaedo?
I wanted to say that I feel like that, I know it may not relate to, but with that death, I feel like he was still being the ultimate teacher right to the end. That's just what I feel, that he was still looking after his flock. But like he was still being the ultimate, I don't know, that's just what I thought.
And why is that? Because he stayed calm and he was
He stayed calm and
yeah.
he tried to make it okay.
Yeah.
For the others.
Mm-hmm.
For his students or for the people that admired him or looked to him.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. So what did we what do we think of the whole argument for the immortality of the soul? I mean, if we just go back and look at all the different arguments he used, I think Demetra was saying that you weren't particularly persuaded.
No, I wasn't, because he says blah blah uneven, you know, that part, and then he says, very good, and what do we call that which does not admit dying? Undying. And soul does not admit death. No, the soul is undying. I can't do that jump. I can't make that jump.
I know. Yeah.
Because I tell you, the fascinating stuff is that, along with definitions and words and things like that, you can argue some stuff, even some of the other stuff, and then it doesn't necessarily follow, I don't think.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. And do maybe if you look at all these arguments, were his other arguments persuasive? The ones he used
sometimes.
Earlier?
Yeah, sometimes. But again, I found it can be like what you do with words or what you do with numbers. You can present them in particular ways. And somewhere someone laughs. What does he do? He laughs, blah, blah. Siebes, or whatever his name is, laughed and said, yes, it is. And it's because he goes through all those words and those, it's almost like a play on words. And it has an element of logic and sense, but you can argue differently as well.
Yeah.
And then you can end up going down a path that it's not. Yeah,
right.
It's quite fascinating. It's fascinating little pathways.
Well, yeah, you've got to keep going down that path. That the path you're going down right now, you've got to keep going down it. That's what I say. But anyway, maybe someone else, how do other people feel about his arguments for the immortality of the soul? Fiona, I think you were a bit skeptical last week, or was that the week before? You wanted to believe it, I think you said.
I'm similar to Demetra when I was thinking about that when we read that part, and then like what was it when I understand that he's trying to like not dissuade his followers from stopping practicing philosophy at his death. So he's also has an interest in trying to like keep them going.
Yeah. Yeah. So he's maybe, do you think maybe he's trying to enchant them? We should tell stories like this to enchant ourselves.
Perhaps.
Yeah, because it has a good outcome, you know.
Yeah.
How did you find it? How did you find it, Paul? The arguments for immortality.
Yeah, I followed the logic of his argument. I think that made sense to me, in that the soul cannot take on the opposite of its formal nature. But I can't remember what was his argument for the soul being like oddness, that it can never take on the opposite of its formal nature.
Yeah, well, it's kind of like a bit of the opposite, I think, argument to when he was doing the sleeping and waking and sleeping. I think there's a bit of conflict between that argument and this argument, if you put them both beside each other. And so one might speculate, especially, let me give you two different things that came up. I think it was last week. Remember when there was that interruption where, was it Ecrates came in and said, oh, wow, I was really persuaded by what Socrates said there. And now these people have brought up these new arguments, you know, he's listening to the story. And now it's all come crashing down. And then Socrates then comes in, you know, in the dialogue itself and says, oh, you know, like I'm almost as bad as the sophists, you know, I've got this huge vested interest, right, in this argument. because I'm about to die. And then a bit later he says, oh, we've got to tell ourselves these stories to enchant ourselves, right? You know, and, you know, maybe the dialogue is about coming to terms with death. Maybe the dialogue, the entire dialogue, is a lullaby for the dying.
Mm.
And this interpret well, maybe if anyone's got any comments about, does anyone want to say anything about that?
Yeah, those words were really powerful. All the, you know, the soul is deathless. It's a fitting contention and a thing worth risking, you know, and the enchanting. All of those things are really powerful words.
Mm-hmm. There's another part which we missed, where he says something like, well, you know, it would be terrible if all the bad people who did bad things got away with it. So we kind of have to tell these stories so that they don't get away with it in the afterlife. And there's a bit of that in the Republic as well, where he's against, he says, he loves his Homer, right? And he's quoting Homer all the time. And in this dialogue, he uses Homer as authority and all that. He says, in my Republic, there's not going to be all these stories about the gods doing bad things and everything. There's going to be no poetry. At first he says, no poetry, none of these stories at all. And then he says, yeah, there'll be poetry, but they will tell stories that stimulate virtue, right? That make people virtuous. And some of these stories, you know, about the afterlife, well, they would sort of promote virtue. So it's kind of like a propaganda. So then one way of interpreting the Phaedo is, you know, if you're not convinced by the immortality stuff, is that it is a lullaby for the dying. But as I think I said last week, for me, if you think about it in that way, it's a bit like those old musicals, you know, where we only remember and we know, you know, these days, the musicals in the 50s and the 40s and stuff, we know the songs from the musicals, but we don't know the narrative that Cole Porter or whoever it was used to string them all together. Because what happens in this dialogue, and why it was really good to start with, is he goes boom, 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 and introduces all these key parts of his positive theory. They're the hit songs in the narrative of the immortality. You know, he sort of uses the alternation generation thing as part of his argument. And, you know, he used participation as part of his argument. He uses all these different things as part of his argument. So it's kind of like, oh, I've got all these great songs. I have to make a story to bring them together. So that's one interpretation, maybe a skeptical interpretation of the dialogue. But there's many others. You know, I mean, and these things that have been brought up, if you read more Plato, they'll come up again and again, and your notion of what he's talking about there will be enriched. You know, when he just talks about generation by opposites, when it just comes up, it seems really weird. You know, how does humans grow and trees grow by generation of opposites? It doesn't really make sense.
But it's still fascinating because you delve into a thinking process yourself, and there's a sort of meditative aspect, for lack of a better word, where you challenge your brain to some concepts, whether they make sense or don't, or you agree with them or don't. So there's that exploration, which is quite, you know, amazing. By each person, their own experiences of that will be different and interesting.
Yeah, Plato is working on you even though you don't know it. You know, Plato has influenced you in you reading this dialogue, in helping turning you around, helping you think about things differently, and sometimes it will be kind of an unconscious sort of thing. And so if you keep reading him, you will be moving more and more around to his way of thinking, including the myths, including the myths. So that's right. That's right, Dimitri. I agree with that. And I mean, the other thing to say about the immortality is what we're saying about 3 and 2 and stuff, you know, is that it's kind of like your immortality is in your nothingness, no thingness, right? So the formal realm is out of time, out of particularity, it's no thing. So the ego self is upset by this because the ego self wants to kind of go to heaven and hang around the bar with all the good people and have a good time, right? Be myself, be my personality, you know, my personality who has a name, has friends and so on. What he's saying is it's actually your no thingness, your no personness, anything that in this world is actually something about you, it's not. So it's kind of disappointing for the ego, the immortality. But what it's saying is that's where you've got to move. You've got to turn around and that's where you've got to move. So you've got to move away from having your center in your ego self to having your center in your formal nature. And that is deathless. Does that make sense? I can see Fee over there shaking her head.
Can you please explain that again? Because I think I didn't get it.
Okay, so maybe are you a scientist, Fee? Have you done science at school or something?
I did some science at school. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Well, you think about the relationship between physics and mathematics, right? So physics has, when they're trying to do a theory of physics, whether it was, you know, when mathematical physics first started in the ancient times, but especially in modern times, the physics had to, working out what was going on with the solar system, with Kepler and Newton, and now these days with string theory or whatever they're trying to do, the physics has to conform with the mathematics, right? If it doesn't, there's something wrong. But where does the mathematics exist that it has to conform to? You know, you draw a circle, you draw a square, and you work out that the diagonal of the square is the square root of 2. But where does that square root of 2, you know, that diagonal actually exist? Does it exist on your page? No, it's just some principle that you only become aware of when you actually draw a square. Well, in the same way, right, he's saying that's how your soul exists. So the island and the sea might conform to the form of oneness. Your soul might conform to the form of oneness, but it's the form of oneness, not your particular self, your physical self, your mental ego self that continues, just oneness continues, which is a bit disappointing.
You know what I saw? I saw that in all these ideas, like the form, the terms just and unjust and all that, they all sort of exist a bit separately because they're different to each other, let's say. But in all of that he talked about, and maybe this is the self or the mind or the soul, the mind or the soul is in all of it. That's how I saw it, and I think it's a celebration of who we are while we're living. I'm still not convinced about this immortality or where all that goes after.
Yeah.
That's what I understood towards the end.
Well, I think that's not a bad way of thinking about it. I think that's a good way to think about it.
Helped me to come a bit closer to this idea of the soul, in a sense.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the
but what lives on, if at all,
is we're waiting for your answer.
we can't see the mind or the forms we can see, like the cup, but we can't. I think that's where it's also.
There was a head of the academy, the Plato's Academy. After Plato died, Socrates, and we hear, although we don't have any of his writings, that he said the soul is a unity, is a one. So the one, you know, we have this notion of one, like, you know, we've been talking about that. The islands is a one that moves itself, that changes itself. So the one, the soul is a self-changing number, self-changing one. Yeah, oneness. If you go into Platonism, especially what's called Neoplatonism, there's a lot of discussion about the notion of the one as the higher principle, but it's also there in Plato, in the Republic and in the Parmenides especially, as the ultimate form, and that everything else is a differentiation of that. And so Socrates identifies the soul with that one, with that self-changing one. How did you go, Levi? What did you think of the final reading? Oh, I don't think you can hear me.
He sort of looks frozen.
Oh, yeah, he's a bit frozen.
You know what I mean? Oh, here he is.
Oh, no, isn't he?
But he said his internet wasn't so good.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, I missed that.
Oh, yeah, just wondering what you thought of the final reading.
Can I reply in a moment?
Yeah, no worries at all. Sorry to disturb you. Yeah, that's okay. Yep.
Oh, he's gone. Bernie, what's with Asclepios and the crow? Like, why? I mean, that was a mystery cult as well. Do you think maybe he's saying that that's the mystery cult he followed? So we owe one. I don't know.
I don't know. Does everyone know what he's talking about? He said the last words that Socrates said was, "We owe a cock to Asclepius." Crito, we ought to offer a cock to Asclepius. See to it and don't forget. Yeah, I don't know. There has been stuff about that. That's the sort of stuff you love, Effie. You're going to have to go and look that up and tell the rest of us. I have read stuff about what that might mean. But
because Artemis saved him from the fire who was being killed at birth, yeah? So he was kind of like a resurrection.
Hang on, who saved who?
Artemis. It's Apollo's son. Asclepios is Apollo's son, and she had an affair, and Apollo burnt it like the Greek gods tend to do, right? And as the mother was burning, Artemis turns up and cuts her belly open and takes him out. So it was like a, I don't know, resurrection kind of thing. I don't know, like he survived the death, right? Like,
yeah, come on. And now related to this offering. So what does it mean?
Well, he did bring people to life, and Zeus punished him for it. So he's got something to do with death, but.
Right, okay, yeah. But we don't know exactly
he
what.
had a whole mystical cult, and I've always wondered which kind of mysticism Plato was in, and he may have been, I don't know, just it is the stuff that I'm interested in.
Well, I mean, I'm fairly persuaded by the idea that, from what I've read, that Pythagoreanism and Orphism were very close. And well, they were certainly close after Plato in the Hellenistic times. And so I would have thought that Plato was close to Orphism. But yeah, who knows? It's all a mystery.
It'll be discovered one day.
So is anyone so people have said they're interested in doing geometry. Is anyone interested in doing the Republic next year? Is that, yeah, oh, okay.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, so that's actually quite big. It's 10 books, and we've worked really hard to try to. Yeah, well, they're short books. Yeah, I mean, where's my Republic? You usually get it in one Penguin volume. It's not too bad, but there's a lot in it, so we kind of have to really emphasize some stuff. And we basically do the greatest hits, which is right in the middle of book 6 and 7. We focus mostly on, which is where you get the cave allegory, but also some other allegories as well, which are quite interesting. And it's all about the education of philosopher, what sort of philosophical education they should have. So there's that core stuff that we do, and then there's a few things that are to the other side. But I give a little narrative going all the way through. So by the end of the class, you get a picture of what's happening all the way through, even in the parts that people often don't read, and you just get a picture of what's, there's this long story about justice, the just person, and then, we can't have a just person without having a just society. So then he goes into this whole, well, how do we do the sociology? How do we create a just society? And then all this stuff comes in about that. And then, well, we need these philosophers running the show. And it's not the sort of society that I'd want to live in, and a lot of people wouldn't want to live in, but there's a lot of interesting stuff about his philosophy that comes up there. But all growing out of what you guys have already done, and so in a way, doing the other classes and reading the other dialogues, there'll be a lot of it's circling around and going up, going over the same material again. I mean, the big thing today, the big thing in this course is really getting the notion, at least, of formal philosophy, of the formal approach. That's the main thing, that it's different from materialism. It's different from what people might call idealism. It's not castles in the air. It's something else. It's paying attention to the forms, which we can think of in various ways. All right. So we're a small group, so we're not so rowdy. We can wind up soon if we like, unless someone's got anything else they want to say. Okay.
Just with this the esoteric geometry, that's over a few weeks, isn't it?
All our classes are in these 6-week blocks.
6 weeks.
And the special thing about geometry is that you have to come into the class, whereas the other ones we are offering, you can do online.
Right.
The Republic's on Wednesday night.
Yeah, and the geometry's on Tuesday night.
Yeah. And people can do both if they wanted to.
Yeah, that's not a problem, Effie. No, yeah, that's actually, I know some people who are doing both. Yeah.
Public online, or is it in the city?
It's in the city. We're offering online, and we're hoping to make it a good experience for those people online. And we're also just wondering whether we will continue to run online only courses, because we've got a few people interstate, but that really just determines on when we do it, like what evening, and filling the class as well. So we'll really see what happens. It was quite funny, really, because I was really apprehensive about moving to online, and now there's this kind of funny transition about moving to face-to-face, because we've got quite a few people interstate, for one, and then we've also got people who are a bit concerned that they don't quite feel safe yet, especially they're in vulnerable groups. And also, if you have to travel into the bloody city, it's quite an effort. Melbourne's a big city and it's hard to get in there. So, and people have got used to online. So yeah, the transition back is almost just as hard as the transition this way.
Can't you do both? Like if you have a face-to-face component, and then people can still attend online who are not able to come face to face,
Yeah, that's what
because
we're
that
doing.
way you don't lose the
That's what we're doing.
interstaters and good.
Yeah,
Good.
that's what we're doing, but it has its problems, and
Why?
some. Because the people who are online, it's hard to make them feel part of the group. That's one thing, especially when discussion's important, like in this course. So I think we can overcome those problems, but that is a problem. That I actually haven't done that, but people who have done it sort of say, "Whoa, be careful."
They do it in politics.
And in politics.
ScoMo and all that. But
Oh,
the other
yeah.
thing is, because I run classes online, like
Yeah.
exercise classes,
Yeah.
and what happens is it falls down when a particular person loses connection, so then they miss out.
Right. Okay.
That's where I think it might be a problem, or getting on in the first place, or you might miss something.